everyone, I'm Stephanie. I'm a book-loving, notebook-hoarding reader and writer on a mission to change lives one book and one notebook at a time. And this is the Get Literate podcast. Each week, we mix together books, notebooks, mindful practices, and creativity to cultivate a life we love. You can expect regular weekly episodes focused on 3 books you need to know about on a bookish theme, and we'll bring those themes to life in our actual lives too. You can also expect author interviews, notebooking inspiration, and topics to help us grow through what we go through. Now, let's grab a notebook and your TBR list and let's get literate. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Get Literate podcast. I'm so excited to kick off a bonus episode right away in 2023 with a special guest. I am so excited about this because I get to talk with an author today, an author I love. I literally felt like a kid on Christmas, all lit up, talking with Teri Brown. Teri is the author of Sunflowers Beneath the Snow and her newest release, An Enemy Like Me. Now, I adored Sunflowers Beneath the Snow a little while back, and I did review it already on my blog. So if you want to take a look, head to alitlife.com and search for it in the search bar. And so I couldn't wait for her newest historical fiction book to come out. I'm lucky enough to be part of her launch team for An Enemy Like Me, and I had the chance to sit down with her and talk with Teri about her books, about writing, and about life. She's amazing, and by the end of this episode, we became friends, like literally. We are now pen pals and email pals and voice pals too. So I know you're going to love her and her books and her enthusiasm just as much as I do. So let's get to my conversation with Teri Brown. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Get Literate podcast. I'm so excited today because we have a guest, and not just any guest, but an author, which is our favorite kind of guest on the Get Literate podcast. So Teri, I am so excited to welcome you to the podcast. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
I am so excited to be here. And the fact that you're that excited really jazzes me up. So this is going to be a great conversation.
Oh, good. I am so glad. So just to give readers a little bit of a background, back in the spring, I got my hands on your first historical fiction novel called Sunflowers Beneath the Snow, and I loved it.
Thank you.
Loved it. It was a very timely book given the situation going on in Ukraine, and it was one of my favorite kinds of books because it followed 3 generations over time in this wonderful back and forth. 3 generations of women to relate to connect to learn from. And it had all the things. It had family and loss. It had separation. It had war. It had ties that bind us all together. Everything I love in a novel, just so neatly packaged up. So when I heard that you had a second novel coming out, I couldn't wait to read it. And even better, now I actually get to talk to you about it. So yes, I am very, very, very excited. So why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you tell listeners who you are, give them your backstory a little bit, and how we came to be sitting on this call, you as an author with your second book, and me, a really adoring fan.
Well, the fact that, first of all, that you're this adoring fan, afterwards, I'm going to hire you. So just so you know, you and I are going to have a conversation about you becoming like my media person.
That works for me.
Yeah. So yeah, I started writing. It's so hard to say when I actually started writing. As a child, I loved to write. I said I wanted to be an author, but I also said I wanted to be a brain surgeon and an Olympic ice skater. And if you know me at all, you know I could never be an Olympic ice skater. I can hardly walk, let alone, with skates, that would be impossible. And then I don't like the sight of blood. So I'm not sure that I really knew that I wanted to be an author, but what I did know was I loved books. and I loved reading. And I have been a reader from kindergarten on. I've read everything. If I could get my hands on it, I read it. And like there was a Trixie Belden series that was like a younger age than a Nancy Drew, and I read all the Trixie Beldens, then I read all the Nancy Drews. Then I was angry that they had the boys' books and I wasn't supposed to read them, so I read all of those too. Um, I just read everything I could get my hands on. And then in 2000, I started writing for small businesses. But I was writing, articles and website content and little ebooks and just stuff that they needed in order for their business to move forward. And I enjoyed doing it. And I still do a little bit. I still have a couple of clients that I work with. But it's not the same thing as writing fiction.
Right.
With the nonfiction writing, it's very safe because it's about whatever that client wants you to write about. And so if I had a real estate client, I was writing about real estate. And if there was somebody who read it and didn't like it, it was probably because they really weren't interested in the topic. There wasn't a lot of me in it. It was just words, and it was facts, and it was me finding a pleasant way to take facts and put them on a page in a way that was pleasing to the eye. I mean, that's about what it was.
Yeah.
I really, really, really wanted to write fiction, but I was also at the time in an emotionally abusive relationship, and it was not good. And he, of course, being who he was not at all for me becoming a writer. In fact, said, well, just because you can write nonfiction doesn't mean you can write fiction. And so I didn't have the bravery to put myself out there because, like I said, when you're talking about your fiction, that's your baby. Those are your thoughts and your ideas and your imagination and your creativity. And if someone doesn't like it, that's hard. And if you're in an emotionally abusive relationship, you don't need hard.
Right.
Like I already had enough of that at home. Well, I got out of that relationship in 2017 and words started spilling out of me. And so I wrote my first manuscript and it was terrible. Horrible. What would you expect from a first, like it wasn't any good, but I tell everyone that it did wonderful things for me because I wrote 50,000 words and I realized that I had, excuse me, so I have a little bit of a cold, so I just got a cough there. That I had 50,000 words in me, which was really quite phenomenal because, I had never tried to write anything that long before. And it had a beginning and a middle and an end. And it did have characters. They were in a setting. And, I have a daughter who is she's very good at telling you the truth and the whole truth.
Mhm.
And when she read it, she said, well, it has good bones. And that meant that there was some good things to it, but it needed a lot of work. But anyway, it taught me that I had it in me. So I wrote another manuscript. And that one, though still not very good, was much better. My characters actually had some depth. In the first manuscript, my character was perfect. She was absolutely perfect, no flaws. It reminded me of those like 1970s and 80s Baywatch type shows where the women dive into the water and come up looking like they just had their makeup and hair
Yes.
done. You
Yes.
know, that's the way this character was, and instead I'm the one that falls into the water and comes up with seaweed in front of my face. And I needed a character that was more real. So
Yeah.
in that second manuscript, I had more real characters, but I still did a whole lot of telling, and not enough showing, and it was flat. So I started another one, and I got about 2/3 of the way done with that one, and my father passed away. And that I've never been able to get back to that one. Every time I go back to it, I get there and it's like, no, I don't know where I was going with it, and my mind goes immediately to my dad passing away unexpectedly, and it just, will that one ever come forth? It may. But then I wrote Sunflowers Beneath the Snow. And that one had like I felt like it had something to it, but I was
Mhm.
still very terrified to let it out into the world because what if people didn't like it, you
Right.
know? So at this point now, I have met my now husband, and we had married. We went on a tandem bicycle ride from the coast of Oregon to Washington, D.C., 3,102 miles. And I tell everyone that on that trip, I healed my soul from, this abusive relationship that I had been on. And I learned a lot about life and myself. And when I came home from that trip, I said, if I can ride across the United States on a tandem bicycle, I can do anything I put my mind to. And I started putting my book out there, and it got with Atmosphere Press and came out in January. So that's how I kind of became the writer. And so that's where that is. Yeah.
I love everything about that story. I especially love you're talking about bravery. And, writing is an act of bravery. It is an act of courage for sure. Um, and as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think about both of the books. You mentioned Sunflowers Beneath the Snow. We're going to talk about your newest one in just a minute. And both of them have generations of characters that to me embody bravery in very different ways. So I was so struck by how that nugget from your own life has woven its way into your characters. And it's the pieces of your characters I love the most because, when you live through the characters and you see those little moments of bravery that end up having big impact, you feel good. You feel like, okay, I could do that. I could do that, especially because the context of both of your books are set in such very difficult historical times, and they're rocking it, right? They're living their lives in really good ways eventually because of that bravery. So I love that I was just able to make that connection after the fact, but still a really wonderful connection.
People ask me whether or not I am in any of my characters. And my answer is I am in all of my characters. I don't know how to write a character that isn't me in some manner. It's either me the way I wish I had been, me the way I once was, but I've changed from, me currently, or at least some of the emotions that I have felt at different times. I bring those forth in these characters. I would be hard pressed to find an author that didn't have some of themselves in their characters,
Right.
especially if their characters have any kind of depth to them,
Yeah.
because how else how do you get your character to feel, to experience, to have the pain, to have the joy, if you haven't had it yourself, at least to some degree in some way, and then found a way to write that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I have to admit, I was thinking that as I was reading your most recent book, which we'll finally tell listeners about in a moment. But I kept thinking, how how did she do this? Because it's one thing to put yourself into the character of a character who's like you, a woman, right? A mother, a sister. But you also were able to just bring to life these characters that were not like you, that lived in a very different time, that acted in a very different way. And that is what really captivated me, was how in the world did she just represent what this man was feeling like this many years ago and get me as a woman in 2022 to feel it so deeply? Like, hats off to you. It was an amazing
Thank you.
experience.
Well, thank you. Yes, so that book is called An Enemy Like Me, and it follows a soldier. He's a first generation American. He is a German American, and just at the point that he thinks his life is going to, start being smooth, he's found the woman of his dreams, and they have a baby, and Japan, you know, bombs Pearl Harbor, and the United States is thrust into World War II. And he doesn't want to go, or he wants to go, kind of wants to go, but doesn't want to go, and decides he's not going to go, and then realizes that he has to go, that he doesn't really have choices anymore because he feels the it's not really racism. I don't know what to call it really, but it was against German Americans. And to the point that he felt like he had to prove that he was really a patriot. And so off he goes to war. So that story follows him going to war and then his wife who's left behind. She was probably the easiest to write because it's a woman and I can, though I've not been left behind for war, I do have friends whose husbands are in the military, and I know some of the angst that they have felt, and I have felt angst, and so it's easy enough to do that. But then I also wrote it from the soldier's perspective and the 4-year-old son's
Yeah.
perspective, as well as him as an adult reflecting back.
Yes.
So yeah, so that's what I think what you were pulling at is that I kind of went from a lot of different perspectives. But I think part of what I do is, although it's a man and he's fighting in war, and we often have this perceived idea that men and women are so vastly different. When it comes to certain feelings, I think that we experience them quite similarly. I mean, he misses his wife and his son. Does he miss them in the exact same way that I would miss? I don't know, but I can base it off of things that I saw in my own father or my brother or my husband. And so that's kind of what I did. I just took my own feelings and then I tempered them with male role models in my own life and said, well, how do I see them experiencing this? They may feel what I feel, but they don't express it in the same way. How do I see it when my father is expressing sadness? How do I see it when my father is expressing or my husband is expressing? And that's kind of what I did. So
Oh, and you did it beautifully.
thank
You
you.
did it beautifully. And I think my favorite thing about the way that you wrote the book, well, actually the way that you wrote both of them, but we're talking more about your newest book, the back and forth, between character to character and past and present was just so powerful. And it makes the reader, at least from my perspective, I feel like I'm more active. I'm more a part of the novel because I'm slowly making these connections of, oh, okay, this is what happened to William when he was 4 from the perspective of Jacob as he's leaving for war. And oh yeah, Bonnie's getting how the mother-in-law who I didn't think I could ever understand, maybe I could, take a piece of it. So I loved those connections that you built. And I'm just fascinated by how in the world you did that. First of all, how a writer just puts it all together. And I'm wondering, was there a certain reason that you chose that structure? Is it just the way your mind works? Is it what you loved as a reader and you brought it to your writing? I would love to know more about that.
It's interesting. I've had so many people talk about, from these different points of views and time periods. I don't think I've thought about it.
Ah,
Like, as I was writing the story, it's what needed to happen to make this story flow in my mind. And everyone is so amazed by it afterward and like, how did you do it? And how did you keep up with it? And it's like, I wish I had great answers. I wish I could say something about, this matrix I had on the wall and that it covered, the walls and I spent hours. It just flowed from me and it made sense. If you're going to talk about war and what does war do to people and how does it affect them, to only talk about it from one perspective makes no sense, because when you have a soldier who has gone to war, it affects him in one way and it affects his family in another. And not just his family in another, but his mother in one way and his wife in one way and his son in one way. And it changes everything. And so I think I just was trying to explore, how is this family navigating this horrific thing that has been thrust upon them? This isn't something that they asked for. This isn't something that they made poor choices and now it was, the consequences of their poor choices. Truly, they were living life, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes a war that tears their family apart.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about that? What's interesting is my family is German American, but generations and generations. I think that my ancestors came over in the early 1700s, so we've been here forever.
Mhm.
My grandfather fought in World War II in Germany, rarely spoke about the war. It was not something that he talked about. I think that's pretty typical of that age. You
Mhm.
know, it was a non-subject. If he talked about the war at all, he usually talked about after the war. He was still in Germany for about 8 months after the war, um, because he couldn't get home yet. There were a lot of soldiers there and only so much transport. And so it took time to get everyone home. And I heard a lot of the funny stories and the fun things in that 8 months, but very little about the war itself. As a teenager, I was probably 14 or 15. One time he must have been feeling very reflective. And he said to me, I always wondered if the person on the other side of my gun was a distant cousin.
Oh, yeah.
And that has stuck
Oh.
with me all these years. And so when I started contemplating another book, that is what stuck with me. And so I kind of took his story very loosely. So there's some family stories in there. If you were to talk to my daughter, she would tell you, oh, yeah, that one is a family story. But it's a very loose family story. You know, I just used some of the stories because that was easier than doing some research and finding someone else's story. But you know, I made it first generation because that has a whole lot more pull to it than, you know, my grandfather felt it with 200 years of being in the United States. You
Mhm.
know, he never knew anything else. His parents spoke English. There was no German anywhere in his home. He just knew he was German American. And that thought was something that he had.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what would it be like if you were closer? You know, if the generations between you living as an American and you being a German
Yeah.
were closer together, what would it be like if you were first generation American? And then that's where the story came from there. So
And that piece of the story definitely resonated with me as a reader, you know, and I'm always connecting to the books. I'm always trying to learn from the characters. I'm trying to, you know, vicariously visit wherever they're visiting.
right.
And for most of the book, it was Bonnie. Like I was gonna, she was the one I was gonna relate to, from maybe not her fashion sense and her interior design, but her ability to pivot, her ability to just do what needs to be done and change the mindset. I was like, okay, this is, I am here for Bonnie. And then at the end, when when Jacob was going through what you just explained, you know, of the person on the other side is like me, and how do I deal with that? How do I reckon with that? What in the world does that mean for my identity? Right? That's when I really started leaning into that and thought, oh my gosh, you know, I'm in a privilege. I haven't ever had to consider that. I haven't had to think of that. I won't have to think of that. And what in the world would that mean for someone who did? So I, as a writer, that's what you were going for. And boy, did it come out on the other side, because, you know, there were moments I just had to set it down and think, wow, okay, what would I do? What would I think? And both of them, you know, gave me lots of lessons to take away from it. And they really were centered on identity and what does it mean to be who we are, and think about where we come from, and how that impacts the generations that come next. Was one of those, oh my goodness, kind of moments, right? The domino effect that can have. So powerful.
I think that a lot of people, you know, you see war, you see World War II, you know, name a war, and we think about that time during the war, and we think about that soldier while fighting. And then maybe we think about them as they come home and kind of reorient. But then we think in our minds, I mean, I know that I do, you kind of forget and you say, okay, well, now everything's fine. They're home and everything's fine. And the truth is that they were gone. And during that period of time, whoever was left at home still continued moving forward. They had no choice.
Right.
Right. And in the case of little William, he's a 4-year-old and he's growing, and he's 6 the next time he sees his father. He's developed, he's become. And part of who he has become is due to not having a father in his home for 2 years.
Right.
Right. And those things follow these children for years. And you can look at soldiers currently, even ones who aren't actively fighting in a war. Sometimes they're taken away out of their family a year at a time. They come home for 6 to 8 months and they're gone again. And this happens over and over. And we look at the soldier, and we should, but do we look at the wife? Do we look at the children? Do we look at the parents? Do we look and do we understand that this is changing people? You know, how war changes people. I mean, that's something that I talk about through the book, is that it changes you. You know, you can't go off and come back and be the same person.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Is that what you're hoping readers will walk away from? Was that on your mind when you were writing it?
That was on my mind. And then I think the other thing that is really on my mind is like, what makes an enemy? You know,
Oh, yes, yes.
because he originally thought he was going to go fight the Japanese. And for him, that was an enemy he could get behind. They bombed Pearl Harbor. They looked different than he did. They sounded different than he did. They ate different foods than he did. He could look across the room and pick out someone Japanese much easier than he could look across the room and pick out someone who, you know, whether or not were they German, or could they be, you know, Swiss, or could they, you know, like, it's harder, right? And so in his mind, he had an enemy, and it was an enemy that he could picture and he could hate. And then they switched that enemy on him to be someone like him, right? Now he's got to figure out what is an enemy. And I want people to come away and ask themselves, what is an enemy? And number 2, do I need the ones that I have? In war, you do need the enemy. I mean, as a soldier, if you don't know who your enemy is, and you're not willing to do what it takes to come home from war, that enemy's willing. And so you're not going to be the one that gets to come home. Right. And so I understand the idea of enemies in war, and I am not anti-military or anything, you know, like I understand. But what happens when we bring those concepts into our everyday life and society? Like right now, we have all kinds of isms and phobias. There's all these things, and there's these people that we put into groups. Whoever we are, we have others that we find and we put into groups. And part of the reason we do that is because we're social beings, and we try to find groups. It's how we feel comfortable and we survive. The problem, though, is when we pit groups against one another. So what makes someone an enemy? You know, what makes them so much different than you? And then my next hope is that if you're thinking that way, that you'll sit down with someone who might be on your enemy list. You know, so let's just say that you've decided that you do not like blonde-haired authors. Okay, so you don't like me. But you and I've now had this conversation, and you've decided, oh, I do actually like Teri. So then you have a couple of choices. You can either say that I'm an exception to the blonde-headed author rule. You can change your rule, or you can live with some cognitive dissonance about, I hate blonde-headed authors, but there's Teri. Okay. You meet enough blonde-haired authors that you like, and you're going to have to change your rule, or live with some really awful, like, how do you live with that idea that I hate all, name the topic, and yet you have all these people that you know that don't fit the rule. right? So my feeling is that, in society, the best way to get over the isms and the phobias and all these things that divide us is to sit down with people and find ways that you connect. How are you alike? We are so much more like our enemies than we are different from them.
Yeah.
So that's really what I hope people start thinking about, is getting into, like, it's, the book is An Enemy Like Me.
Right. Right.
He recognizes that he and the enemy are essentially the same person. And when my husband and I were going across the United States, we went in the summer of 2020, COVID summer,
Oh,
and riot summer,
yeah.
and all of the political upheaval summer, right? So you would think that we would have had a horrific experience meeting people, and it's not true.
Mm.
We met hundreds, if not thousands, of people going across the United States who were of all walks of life, different colors, nationalities, political affiliations, sexual orientations, religions, socioeconomic status, you name it, we met it going across the United States. And do you know what we found? People are pretty wonderful. And as we got talking with just about everyone, we would find a connection. They had been potentially to the North Carolina beaches where we live, and we would start talking about that. They enjoyed bicycling. We would talk about that. They had grandchildren the same age as our grandchildren. We would start talking about that. And as soon as we found that connection, everything that separated us didn't matter.
Yeah.
Never once did I ask someone, so what's your political affiliation, so that I know whether I can speak to you.
Right.
Right? It didn't come up because it didn't matter. And so that's the other thing I really hope that this book does, is it helps people really start to think about, who are your enemies, and is that important in your life to have that? And if not, what can you do to break that barrier back down? So.
Oh, I've got goosebumps with that. I have goosebumps with that. A historical fiction novel with such real life application for today. I mean, that's why we read. That's why I read. That's why I hope lots of people read. That's the whole basis of this podcast, is that we read books to change our lives, to change ourselves, to think differently, to think bigger or more creatively, or whatever it is. And this book is a catalyst for that. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that you got brave enough to put those fiction stories out there and didn't stop at the nonfiction copywriting, because there was definitely these wonderful gifts that were, they were still there. I'm so excited to talk to you. So tell readers, when can they get their hands on this book? How can they find you? How can they learn more?
All right. So the book is coming out January 24th. They can pre-order now on Amazon. You can pre-order at my website. It's www.terimBrown.com. That's Teri with one R. So terimBrown.com. You can pre-order there if you're in the United States. If you're outside of the United States, I'm sorry, I don't do foreign shipping. It gets outrageously crazy. It will, as of the 24th, it will also be available as a digital copy, so you can get it digitally. Also, you'll be able to get that on Amazon and my website as well. If you go to the website, you can find all of my social media. I'm on everything. I don't know that I do everything well, but you can find me there. I'm even trying TikTok, which is really quite humorous. I'm soon
Talk
to be
about
60.
bravery.
Yeah, I'm soon to be 60. I don't know that too many 60-year-olds put themselves out on TikTok, but there I am. I'm trying. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, you can find all of my social media. I also have a contact form. Feel free to reach out to me. I love talking with people. I love talking with you about my books, other books you've enjoyed reading, the writing process, my ride across the United States, your grandchildren. Like, I just love to talk. So feel free to reach out. And then I have a newsletter that you can sign up for. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you get a list of the 10 historical fiction you've never heard of that will bring you to tears.
Oh, what that's an attention grabber right there. I love that.
So
What?
yeah, my thought is that there are so many authors out there who
Yeah.
write amazing books, but don't necessarily make, the New York Times bestseller or any other bestseller list, but it doesn't mean that they don't write amazing stories.
Yeah.
So I reached out to people who were historic fiction fans and said, some of the books that you love that aren't making those top lists, that aren't, bestsellers on Amazon or whatever. And so we kind of took some of what they gave me and I created that list for you, and that's what's out there for now. So
Oh, I love it. And honestly, my mind's spinning because the other regular episodes on the podcast. So today's a Thursday when this is going live in real life, but on Tuesdays, I share 3 books that are on a particular theme. And so now my mind is spinning of three backlist, maybe lesser known historical fiction books that could rock our world would be
right,
a nice theme
right.
coming up.
Well, see, and I love that idea, because what happens a lot with the top list. Now, don't get me wrong. I would gladly accept a position on the New York Times bestseller. So I am not knocking it. But what happens on those lists, if you look, you'll start seeing trends. And it'll be topics that are very similar. And it will last for months. And then slowly it changes, and then it's kind of a new topic. So it's kind of like the flavor of the month or of the quarter or whatever.
Mhm.
And there isn't anything wrong with that. But if you only stick to that list, you're going to miss a lot of really good literature out there,
Yeah,
because there are things that don't quite fit what they're looking for, but it doesn't mean that it's not good.
right.
And then the other thing that you miss are people like me. I'm brand new. I'm a debut author. There's no way that my first book was going to hit New York Times bestsellers list in the first year, because no one knew who I was. So, but my book is a good book. But if you only stuck to the list, you'd miss my book and hundreds of other authors out there. So I'm also a firm believer in like open yourself up, be willing to read more than one genre. I'm a historic fiction writer right now. I have some ideas for other. I have a rom-com idea in my head right now, so you never know
Ooh.
where I'm going. Yeah, it's about a woman who's going through menopause.
Oh, that's okay.
And so, like, that's funny all by itself. I don't even usually when I say that, everyone starts to laugh, and
I
it's like I
know.
don't even have to say anything else. It's funny just because, right? But my goal is, I love writing about characters that my readers connect with,
Mhm.
and that because of that connection, the genre doesn't matter quite as much. Yes, you may normally like historical fiction, but because you know that I write a deep character that you are going to connect with, you're willing to go with me to a rom-com, or you're willing to go with me to something that has maybe a little bit of fantasy to it, or maybe a little bit of dystopian something. Not because it's your genre, but because the character is worth going to that place.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, I tell everyone I try to introduce my readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch.
Yes. And
So,
you do. You do. Your characters from your first book are still in my mind. Those women, their strength, that's still there. And now I have a whole new set of characters to love too. So many books, so little time. And I'm so glad you took the time to come here, because now at least my listeners will be able to know about your books and hopefully go get their hands on both Sunflowers Beneath the Snow and An Enemy Like Me. Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you for coming on the podcast today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the time that you've taken with me.
Oh, happy to. Wasn't that such a great episode with Teri? I so enjoyed talking with her, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Her enthusiasm, her love of writing, her books, they're infectious. So go grab Sunflowers Beneath the Snow if you haven't already. And of course, grab her newest book, An Enemy Like Me, and get ready, Get ready to get comfy and stay a while, because once you get invested in that book, you won't want to stop. So that's it for today. I'll see you next week for another episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Get Literate podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to join my Patreon community. There, you'll find additional inspiration for your reading and writing lives, like bonus podcast episodes, book calendars, monthly book clubs, notebooking challenges, live events, giveaways, and much more. It's only $5 a month, and you get instant access to all the previous content too. You can learn more at getliterate.co. But one more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish and notebookish community too. Thanks so much for listening.